Blind veterans' prayer, interrupted by bikers. What happens next is unbelievable. John Martinez sat in his usual spot by the window of Marcy's roadside diner, his fingers gently resting on the worn leather cover of his Bible. It was a routine he had cherished for years. Every Thursday morning, he'd stop by the small diner for a quiet meal, away from the noise of the outside world. Though he couldn't see the sun streaming through the glass, he could feel its warmth on his face. The smells of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the soft clatter of plates and silverware as waitresses bustled from table to table. The hum of the diner was familiar and comforting. It was the kind of place where truck drivers, retirees, and the occasional traveler stopped for a hearty meal and a moment's rest. But for John, it was more than that. It was a sanctuary. With his sightless eyes hidden behind dark glasses, John bowed his head in silent prayer before his meal. His weathered hands, marked by years of hard labors and the scars of war, gripped the Bible as if it anchored him to a world he could no longer see. Though his life had been filled with pain and loss, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed to command respect from those who knew him. The peaceful atmosphere of the diner was suddenly shattered by the roar of motorcycle engines. A group of leather-clad bikers pulled into the gravel parking lot, their loud laughter and shouting carrying through the open door as they entered. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Rick, strode in first. His presence was commanding, with a thick beard and a cocky smirk that made it clear he was used to being the center of attention. The other bikers followed close behind, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor.
"Looks like the breakfast rush is over,"
Rick announced loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of conversation.
"Guess we'll liven this place up."
The group erupted into laughter, their rowdy energy clashing with the otherwise calm environment. Regular patrons glanced up from their plates, some with mild irritation, others with unease. The waitresses exchanged nervous looks but continued about their work, hoping the newcomers wouldn't cause trouble. John remained still, his head bowed in prayer, seemingly oblivious to the disruption. Rick's sharp eyes scanned the diner, taking in the faces of the customers. When his gaze landed on John, seated alone with his Bible in hand, his smirk deepened. He nudged one of his companions and muttered something, drawing a chuckle.
"Hey,"
Rick called out loudly, striding toward John's table.
"what's this? We got ourselves a holy man over here?"
The other bikers laughed as Rick stopped a few feet from John's table, folding his arms across his chest.
"What you praying for, old man?"
He sneered.
"You think your invisible sky daddy's gonna bring your eyesight back?"
The group howled with laughter, their voices echoing through the diner. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one intervened. The waitresses avoided eye contact, unwilling to risk escalating the situation. John, however, remained calm. He finished his prayer and opened his hands, resting them lightly on the table. He didn't respond to Rick's taunts, nor did he acknowledge the bikers' laughter. His composed demeanor seemed to unnerve them, though Rick wasn't about to let it show.
"Hey, I'm talking to you,"
Rick said, leaning closer.
"What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, or maybe you're too busy having a one-on-one with the man upstairs?"
The other bikers snickered, their laughter growing louder as Rick's mocking tone became more pointed.
You know,"
Rick continued,
"I've always wondered, what's it like talking to someone who never talks back? Seems like a waste of time to me, but hey, maybe you've got all the answers, huh?"
Still, John didn't react. He reached for his coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip before setting it back down. His calmness only fueled Rick's frustration.
"Come on, old man,"
Rick pressed, his voice growing harsher.
"You think you're better than us, sitting there all high and mighty pretending you're some kind of saint? You don't even know who you're dealing with."
The tension in the diner was palpable. The other patrons watched in silence, their discomfort evident. Even the bikers seemed uncertain now, glancing at one another as if questioning whether Rick was taking things too far. Finally, John spoke. His voice was soft but steady, carrying a weight that silenced the room.
"Your laughter hides pain you don't want anyone to see,"
he said simply, his head tilting slightly in Rick's direction. The words hung in the air like a challenge, cutting through the bravado and mockery. Rick froze, his smirk faltering as he stared at the older man.
"What did you say?"
Rick demanded, though his voice lacked the same confidence as before. John turned his sightless eyes toward Rick, the dark glasses obscuring his gaze but not the strength behind it.
I said,
John repeated.
your laughter hides pain you don't want anyone to see. Mockery is just a shield. It's easier to tear someone else down than to face what's broken inside of you.
For a moment, the diner was completely silent. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter now replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. Even the waitresses paused in their work, drawn to the tension unfolding before them. Rick's jaw tightened and his fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. John's calm yet piercing statement had struck a nerve, and he couldn't hide it.
You don't know anything about me.
Rick finally said, his voice low and defensive. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, folding his hands over his Bible.
You're right.
He said after a moment.
I don't know your story, but I do know what it feels like to carry pain you think no one else can understand. And I know that no amount of noise or laughter will ever make it go away.
Rick stared at John, his expression unreadable. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now replaced by an awkward silence. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted entirely. What had started as an attempt to humiliate the blind veteran had turned into something far more profound. Rick finally took a step back, breaking eye contact with John. He turned toward his companions, muttering something under his breath. The bikers, unsure of what to do, followed his lead, retreating to a booth in the corner. As the group settled into uneasy silence, the other patrons in the diner began to relax. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the waitresses returned to their work. John sat quietly at his table, his face serene as he reached for his fork and began to eat. Though the disruption had passed, the impact of his words lingered in the air, leaving a sense of reflection in its wake. Rick sat in the corner booth, staring at the tabletop as if it might offer answers. His plate of half-eaten pancakes lay untouched, his earlier appetite dulled by a knot of unease in his chest. He had always been the loudest in the room, the one who joked the most, laughed the hardest, and made sure no one got too close. But this time, someone had seen through him. A blind man, no less. It unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. Finally, he looked up, his eyes narrowing at John Martinez, who was still calmly eating at his table. The older man's unshaken demeanor gnawed at Rick, as though the mere act of being so composed was a silent challenge. He couldn't let it go. Not yet. Rick pushed back his chair and walked back toward John's table. The diner quieted again, forks pausing midair and coffee cups hovering just below lips, as the other patrons braced for another confrontation.
What do you know about our pain, huh?
Rick demanded, his voice less aggressive this time, but still defensive. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to project confidence.
You talk like you've got it all figured out, but you don't know anything about me or my life.
John slowly set his fork down, his fingers brushing the edge of his plate before resting in his lap. He tilted his head slightly, his sightless eyes hidden behind dark glasses, and for a moment he said nothing. The silence was heavy, as though he was measuring his words carefully before speaking.
You're right,
John said softly.
I don't know your story, but I do know something about pain. More than you might think.
Rick raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing across his face.
Oh yeah, like what?
John leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the Bible in front of him. His voice, calm and steady, carried through the diner, drawing the attention of everyone present.
I was 24 when I joined the army.
John began, his tone reflective.
It wasn't just about serving my country. I needed purpose. I grew up in a small town not too different from this one, and life didn't have much direction for me back then. The military gave me structure, discipline, and a sense of belonging.
The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of where the story was going, but Rick didn't interrupt. He leaned against the edge of the table, his arms still crossed, as if daring John to prove himself.
I served for 10 years.
John continued.
Most of it was overseas, in places I'd never heard of before I set foot there. I saw things I wouldn't wish on anyone. War strips away a lot of things. Comfort, certainty, innocence. But it also shows you who you really are when everything else is gone.
He paused, his fingers brushing the cover of his Bible, as though drawing strength from it. The other patrons in the diner leaned in subtly, their interest piqued despite themselves.
It was my last tour,
John said, his voice tinged with both sorrow and pride.
We were stationed in a hostile area, running missions to protect civilians and secure the region. One day, our convoy was ambushed. Gunfire erupted from all sides and chaos broke out. I'll never forget the sound of it, bullets tearing through metal, the shouts of my comrades, the screams of the injured.
The room was so quiet now that even the soft hum of the diner's refrigerator seemed loud. Rick's arms slowly dropped to his sides, his tough exterior beginning to crack as he listened.
There was a grenade.
John said, his voice lowering.
It landed near our vehicle, and I knew what would happen if it went off. I didn't think, I just acted. I shoved one of my men out of the way and covered the blast with my body. The explosion took my sight, shattered my body, and left me lying in the dirt, wondering if I'd ever make it home.
Rick blinked, the bravado in his eyes replaced by something softer. One of the other bikers muttered under his breath.
Damn.
John smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it.
They said I was a hero, but lying in that hospital bed, blind and broken, I didn't feel like one. All I could think about was what I'd lost. My sight, my career, my independence. I was angry, bitter. I blamed the world, the enemy, even God.
He lifted his chin slightly, his voice taking on a resolute tone.
But bitterness doesn't heal wounds, it doesn't bring back what's lost, and it doesn't make the pain go away. I had to make a choice, to let anger consume me, or to find a way forward.
The bikers were silent now, their earlier mocking forgotten. Even Rick, who had started this confrontation with so much bluster, seemed subdued.
I found that way through forgiveness,
John said.
Not just forgiving the ones who hurt me, but forgiving myself for the anger I carried. I realized that strength isn't about how much you can endure. It's about what you do with the pain. Do you let it harden your heart, or do you use it to grow? Do you choose anger, or do you choose compassion?
Rick shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between John and the floor.
And what if you can't forgive?
He asked quietly, the defensiveness in his tone replaced by a hint of vulnerability. John turned his head slightly as if he could see Rick despite his blindness.
Forgiveness isn't easy,
he admitted.
It's not something you do once and forget about. It's a choice you make every day, even when it feels impossible. But the more you choose it, the lighter the burden becomes.
The other patrons in the diner sat frozen, their meals forgotten as they absorbed John's words. One of the waitresses wiped at her eyes with the edge of her apron, trying to hide her tears. Even the bikers, who had entered with so much bravado and noise, were uncharacteristically quiet. Rick let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair.
I didn't mean to...
He trailed off, his voice faltering.
I didn't think...
John offered a faint smile.
We all carry burdens, Rick. Sometimes they make us lash out at others because we don't know how else to deal with the weight. But strength doesn't come from pretending we don't feel pain. It comes from facing it and choosing to let it make us better, not bitter.
The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rick didn't respond right away, but the hardness in his expression softened. He stepped back slightly, his arms dropping to his sides as he looked at John with something close to respect. Around the diner, the other patrons exchanged glances, their earlier unease giving way to quiet reflection. The mocking atmosphere that had filled the room when the bikers first arrived had been replaced by something far deeper, a collective sense of humility and introspection. John picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip, as though the moment hadn't just shifted the entire energy of the diner. For him, this was simply the truth of life. Pain was universal, but so was the choice to rise above it. The air in the diner felt different now, quieter yet heavy with unspoken thoughts. Rick leaned against the counter, his leather jacket creaking as he crossed his arms over his chest, staring at the worn tiles on the floor. The bravado that had defined him just moments ago was gone, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar sensation: vulnerability. John's calm voice, steady and patient, echoed in Rick's mind. Strength doesn't come from pretending we don't feel pain. It was as if those words had reached into a part of Rick he had buried long ago, a part of him that he didn't want to face. Rick let out a low sigh, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He glanced at John, still seated at his booth, the older man's hands resting lightly on the Bible in front of him. There was no trace of judgment in John's face, just a quiet patience as if he were waiting, not for an apology, but for understanding.
You got me thinking.
Rick said finally, his voice quieter than before. He shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence replaced by hesitation.
What you said about pain. You were right. I've been carrying some of my own.
The other bikers, who had been watching Rick with a mix of confusion and curiosity, exchanged uncertain glances. Rick never opened up about anything, especially not in front of strangers.
Yeah?
John said gently, tilting his head slightly in Rick's direction.
Tell me about it.
Rick hesitated, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words.
I don't even know where to start,
he muttered. He glanced at the floor again, avoiding John's sightless gaze, as if even the blind man could see through the walls Rick had built around himself. After a long pause, Rick spoke, his voice strained.
There's a lot I've screwed up. My old man always said I'd never amount to anything, and I guess I started believing him after a while. Tried proving him wrong, you know. Took up a trade, worked my ass off, got married, thought I had it figured out, but things don't always go the way you plan.
He paused, rubbing the back of his neck, his expression shadowed by regret.
The marriage didn't last. She left, said I was too angry all the time, too distant. Can't really blame her, I guess. I didn't know how to deal with everything I was feeling, so I just pushed it all down, but it catches up to you eventually, doesn't it?
John nodded, his expression compassionate.
It always does, but acknowledging it is the first step toward letting it go.
Rick swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He hadn't planned on saying any of this. Not here, not now, and certainly not to a man he had mocked just minutes earlier. But there was something about John's presence, his unwavering calm, that made it feel safe to open up, even in the middle of a crowded diner. One of the bikers, a burly man with a grizzled beard, cleared his throat.
You're not the only one, Rick,
he said gruffly, his voice tinged with hesitation.
I've got my own demons, too.
Rick turned to him, surprised.
What are you talking about, Pete?
Pete shrugged, avoiding Rick's gaze.
You ever wonder why I drink so much? It's not just for fun. Lost my brother a few years back. We were close, real close. He always looked out for me when we were kids. But I wasn't there for him when he needed me most. Didn't even pick up the phone that night. And now...
His voice cracked, and he quickly looked away, blinking back tears.
Now I'll never get the chance to make it right.
The diner was silent, save for the faint clinking of plates from the kitchen. Even the other patrons, who had been trying to mind their own business, couldn't help but listen as Pete's confession hung heavy in the air. Another biker, a younger man with a nervous energy, shifted in his seat.
I don't really talk about this.
He began hesitantly.
But my dad's in prison. He's been there since I was a kid. People don't really get what that's like, you know? Growing up with everyone looking at you like you're going to end up just like him. Sometimes I think they're right.
You're not your father.
John said firmly, his voice cutting through the young man's self-doubt.
Your path is your own to choose. Don't let anyone take that from you.
The young man nodded, his throat tight with emotion. One by one, the bikers began to open up, sharing pieces of themselves they had never voiced before. Tales of broken families, lost loved ones, regrets that lingered like ghosts. Each story was raw and unpolished, but it was real. Rick listened in silence, his tough exterior softening with each word. He had always thought of himself as the leader, the one who held the group together. But now he realized that they had all been holding on to pain they couldn't talk about, not even with each other. When the last of them had spoken, an uneasy silence settled over the diner. It was Rick who finally broke it, his voice tinged with vulnerability.
I'm sorry,
he said, his words directed at John.
For what I said earlier, for mocking you. I thought making fun of someone else would make me feel better about my own crap, but all it did was make me feel worse.
John offered a gentle smile, his expression radiating warmth and understanding.
It takes courage to admit when you're wrong,
he said.
And even more courage to face the things that hurt us. You've already taken the first step, Rick.
Rick looked down at his boots, unsure of what to say.
I don't know if I can fix everything I've screwed up,
he muttered.
No one can change the past,
John replied.
but you can choose what you do with the time you have now. Forgiveness of yourself and others is where healing begins, and every step forward, no matter how small, is a step toward freedom from the pain you've been carrying.
The bikers nodded silently, John's words resonating deeply. Even the diner's patrons, who had been silent observers to the unfolding drama, seemed moved. For the first time in what felt like years, Rick allowed himself to let go of the weight on his shoulders, even if only a little. And as he looked around at his friends, he realized they were doing the same. The tough, leather-clad group that had entered the diner full of bravado and mockery now sat quietly, their walls cracked, their pain laid bare. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted, something that could only be described as the beginning of healing. John sat back in his booth, his hands resting on the Bible. His face was serene, his work, at least for now, done. The silence in the diner was no longer tense. It had softened, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts and emotions. Rick, leaning against the counter, exhaled deeply. For a moment he looked younger, as if some of the years of anger and frustration had been lifted. The bravado that had defined him and his crew when they walked in was nowhere to be seen. Rick ran a hand over his face, his rough exterior cracking just enough to let something real slip through.
You know,
He began, his voice steady but low.
I don't think I've felt truly strong into a long time.
He paused, glancing at the table where John still sat, calm and composed, his hands resting lightly on the Bible before him.
I've spent so much time acting tough, pretending I've got it all together, but you didn't need to do any of that.
John tilted his head slightly, listening, his sightless eyes focused somewhere beyond the room. Rick continued, his voice softening.
When we walked in here, we were looking for someone to take our crap out on. You didn't give us that. You didn't fight back or yell or call us out. You just sat there, and then you talked to us like we were worth something. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to finish. I guess I just wanted to say thanks for not giving up on us, even when we didn't deserve it.
The bikers sat quietly, absorbing Rick's words. A few nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Pete, who had earlier shared his grief over losing his brother, clapped a hand on Rick's shoulder, a silent show of support. The younger biker, who had spoken about growing up with his father in prison, stared at his hands, his lips pressed tightly together, lost in thought. John smiled gently, his expression warm and understanding.
It takes strength to admit that you've been hiding behind a mask,
He said.
but strength doesn't mean you have to do it all alone. True strength comes from connection, from leaning on others when you need to and being there for them in return.
Rick nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought back the emotion welling up inside him.
Yeah, I get that now, maybe for the first time.
A hush fell over the diner as the exchange settled in. The tension that had filled the room when the bikers first arrived had completely dissipated, replaced by something intangible but deeply felt. A shared sense of peace, of connection, of respect. The moment didn't go unnoticed. Across the diner, the other patrons, who had been quiet observers throughout the confrontation and transformation, began to shift in their seats. Conversations started in hushed tones, and a few exchanged knowing looks. The ripple effect of John's words and the biker's vulnerability was beginning to spread. One of the waitresses, a young woman with a kind smile and tired eyes, approached John's table hesitantly. She held a coffee pot in one hand, the other clutching a worn notepad.
Mr. John,
She said softly, her voice tinged with nervousness.
I wanted to thank you.
Her cheeks flushed as she spoke, but she pressed on.
You've reminded us all to be better, I think. To look at each other differently.
John turned his face toward her, his expression gentle.
What's your name, young lady?
Jessica,
She replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear.
I've been working here for a while and, well, it's easy to forget sometimes with how people can be, that there's still good out there. But hearing you tonight, it's like you've lit a little spark in here.
She tapped her chest lightly over her heart.
So, thank you.
John's smile widened.
Thank you, Jessica. And don't forget, kindness has a way of spreading. It starts with small moments, like this one.
Jessica nodded, blinking back tears as she poured him another cup of coffee before retreating to the counter. Inspired by her courage, another patron spoke up, an older man seated with his wife at the booth near the window. He cleared his throat awkwardly, raising his hand slightly as if in a classroom.
I don't mean to interrupt,
He began, his gravelly voice carrying across the room.
but I just want to say, I've been sitting here thinking about a lot of things. You don't expect to walk into a diner and leave feeling like you've been to church, you know? But that's how it feels tonight.
His wife nodded beside him, dabbing her eyes with a napkin.
It's a reminder we all needed.
She added,
We don't know what people are carrying, but maybe if we took the time to listen more, well, the world might not feel so heavy.
The room murmured in agreement, the atmosphere growing lighter with each word. Even the cook, who had poked his head out from the kitchen to see what was going on, gave a nod of approval before disappearing back behind the counter. For the bikers, the shift in the room was palpable. They had come in loud and brash, but now they were surrounded by quiet admiration, not for their toughness or intimidation, but for their ability to face their own pain and begin to lay it down. Rick stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and turned toward John. The older man rose as well, steadying himself with one hand on the table. For a moment, they faced each other, two men from very different worlds, bound by an unspoken understanding. Rick extended his hand.
I don't think we'll ever forget tonight,
He said.
You've given us a lot to think about, thank you.
John grasped Rick's hand firmly, his grip strong despite his years.
The road forward isn't always easy, but it's worth walking.
He said.
Take care of each other out there.
Rick nodded, his throat too tight to respond. He turned back to his crew who were already gathering their things, their usual swagger replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful demeanor. As they made their way toward the door, the other patrons watched them go, some nodding in quiet approval. Jessica, standing near the counter, called out after them.
Hey,
The bikers turned back, curious.
come back sometime, okay? You're always welcome here.
Rick managed a small smile.
We just might.
The door jingled as they left, the roar of their motorcycles soon fading into the distance. Inside the diner, the patrons returned to their meals, but the atmosphere remained changed. Conversations were quieter, more meaningful. Strangers exchanged kind words. The energy in the room was undeniably different, lighter, yet somehow deeper. John sat back down in his booth, sipping his coffee with a contented sigh. He had no way of seeing the expressions around him, but he didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room, the way people had softened, opened, connected. Jessica returned to his table, a hesitant smile on her face.
Do you need anything else, Mr. John?
No, thank you, Jessica. You've done plenty already.
She lingered for a moment before speaking again.
You know, I think tonight was something special. Something we'll all remember.
John nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips.
That's the beauty of moments like this. You never know how far the ripples will reach.
As the night wore on, the diner slowly emptied, but the echoes of what had transpired lingered in the minds of everyone who had been there. One moment, one conversation had sparked a ripple effect, a reminder that even in a world often filled with pain and anger, there was still room for connection, healing, and hope. The rumble of the motorcycles grew fainter as the bikers rode off into the night, their usual thunderous departure replaced by a subdued hum. For the first time in years, Rick wasn't wearing his mask of bravado. His grip on the handlebars felt different, less tense, less like a shield. His thoughts swirled with John's words, with the reflections shared by the other patrons, and with the raw truths his crew had unearthed tonight. The ride was quiet, not the usual roar of laughter and teasing that typically accompanied their travels. Pete, who rode closest to Rick, glanced at his leader's profile, noticing the furrow in his brow and the distant look in his eyes. He said nothing, sensing that Rick was processing something profound. Rick's own mind was a storm of emotions. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that terrified him. Yet it wasn't entirely unpleasant. John's unwavering calm, his ability to look past the aggression and see the human beneath, had chipped away at Rick's armor. He thought of his own struggles, the heartbreak he'd never dealt with, the guilt he carried over mistakes he'd made, and the nagging feeling that he'd been running from himself for years. As the miles passed under his wheels, something shifted. It was subtle, a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep hiding. Maybe he could start facing the pain he'd buried and find a way to be better, for himself and for the people around him. Behind him, his crew was equally silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The bravado and aggression that had fueled their entrance into the diner were gone, replaced by a quiet introspection. They weren't quite sure what had changed, but they knew they'd leave this night different than how they had started it. Inside the diner, John sat quietly in his booth. The echoes of conversation had faded, leaving a serene stillness. He bowed his head, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, and murmured a prayer.
Thank you, Lord.
He said softly.
Thank you for letting me be here tonight, for giving me the chance to reach someone who needed it. I don't know what seeds were planted, but I trust that you'll help them grow.
Jessica, the waitress, approached his table, balancing a slice of warm apple pie on a small plate. She placed it in front of him, her smile shy but genuine.
This is on the house.
She said, tucking her notepad into her apron pocket.
Consider it a thank you for everything.
John smiled in her direction, his gratitude evident.
Thank you, Jessica. That's very kind of you.
She lingered for a moment, as if searching for the right words.
You know, I've worked here for years, and I've seen all kinds of people come through those doors. But tonight was different. What you said, what happened, it's something I'll carry with me.
John nodded, his expression warm.
That's the beauty of moments like this. We're all connected in ways we can't always see. Every kind word, every act of grace, it ripples outward.
Jessica blinked quickly, her eyes misting. She gave him a small nod before returning to the counter, leaving John to enjoy his pie in peace. Around the diner, the other patrons were gathering their things, ready to head back into the world. But something had shifted. They no longer seemed like strangers, passing through the same space. There was a quiet camaraderie in the way they exchanged glances and murmured goodbyes. The older couple who had shared their reflections earlier stopped by John's table on their way out.
Thank you.
The man said, his voice gruff with emotion.
You've reminded us of something important tonight.
His wife smiled, placing a hand on her husband's arm.
Take care of yourself, Mr. John. The world needs more people like you.
John chuckled softly.
And it needs more people like you, too. Safe travels.
One by one, the patrons filtered out, their faces thoughtful, their steps lighter. The cook in the kitchen whistled a cheerful tune as he scrubbed the grill, the energy in the diner noticeably different. It felt as though a collective weight had been lifted, as though everyone had left a piece of their burdens behind. Jessica stood by the counter, watching as the last few customers left. She glanced over at John, who was still seated in his booth, the plate of pie nearly empty. The sunlight streaming through the window caught his profile, illuminating the serene smile on his face. She couldn't help but wonder what it was about him that made such a difference. He wasn't loud or flashy. He hadn't demanded attention or tried to prove a point. He'd simply been himself, steady, kind, and willing to listen. For Rick, the ride home was the beginning of a new chapter. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off his bike, he sat in the stillness of the night, staring at the stars overhead. He thought about John's words, about the idea that true strength came from connection and vulnerability. For years, he'd worn his toughness like a badge, believing it was the only way to survive in a world that could be so harsh. But tonight had shown him another way. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe it wasn't too late to be the kind of man who didn't need to hide behind a tough exterior. He made a silent promise to himself, to face his pain, to reach out to those he'd pushed away, and to try, really try, to be better. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like it was possible. Back at the diner, John finished the last bite of his pie and set his fork down with a satisfied sigh. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his face, a gentle reminder of the new day that awaited. As he sat there basking in the quiet moment, he reflected on the night. He didn't know where the bikers were headed or what choices they'd make, but he had faith that something had shifted in their hearts, and that was enough. The door jingled as Jessica approached with the check, but John waved her off.
No need, my dear.
He said with a smile.
The pie was more than enough.
Jessica hesitated, then nodded.
Thank you, Mr. John, for everything.
He reached out, giving her hand a gentle pat.
Take care of yourself, Jessica. And remember, kindness has a way of coming back to you.
She watched as he stood, gathered his things, and made his way to the door. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to follow him, casting a warm glow over his retreating figure. As the diner settled into the quiet rhythm of the early morning, the memory of what had transpired lingered in the hearts of everyone who had been there. It was a reminder that even the smallest moments, shared words, acts of kindness, and the courage to be vulnerable, could create ripples far beyond what anyone could imagine. And as John stepped out into the sunlight, a faint smile on his face, he knew that the seeds of compassion and hope he had planted tonight would continue to grow, touching lives in ways he might never see.